I'm going to try to come at this from a different perspective in several ways from what David charged me to do ahead of time. I've had concerns about how I was going to do this. Some of you know a little bit about the work of my colleagues and myself. Others are going to end up saying, what the heck was he talking about? Because it's going to be like taking a drink out of a fire hose in a couple of ways. But let's see where we end up. All right, it seems like we got several questions that I'm supposed to be addressing around how do we evaluate the implementation of multiple evidence-based programs and influenced ones. So one of the questions is going to be, how can we best assess readiness for implementation? How can we best assess impact of each? And how can we assess the combined effects? My agenda is to come at this from being a change process researcher. And one of the things that I've run into right off is we have a problem of vocabulary. The health professions talk about interventions. Those of us in change process research distinguish between the change, aka the innovation, and we use the word interventions as to be those actions that you take to help get the innovation implemented. So you're going to see in my slides I'm schizophrenic. Sometimes I talk about innovation, sometimes I talk about intervention, but that's one of the messages right off. Technical assistance is an intervention to me. The innovation would be cessation of smoking or something like that. So hopefully that'll help. The other thing that's going to happen in this is I'm going to talk about it from the concerns-based perspective, which most of you won't know about, but if you want to see what some academic could come up with, there it is. We got boxes and arrows and vocabulary, icons and stuff going everywhere. What will happen is we're really only going to talk about the shaded boxes right now, and I want to use those three constructs to try to talk about how we can do evaluation with a focus on implementation. In our work, we use some metaphors along the way. So I'm going to use one of my favorite metaphors, which begins with, we have agencies. In this case, it happens to be a school, but it could be a business, it could be a community, so keep that in mind in terms of what I'm talking. It's doing whatever it's doing. And then for some reason, we want differences in outcomes and outputs. And we all know that if you keep doing what you've been doing, you'll probably get what you've always got, which says there's got to be some sort of new practices. Now, in my metaphor, and having lived in Las Vegas for a couple of years, the metaphor works really well. If you think about the Grand Canyon, there tends to be a gap between what we're doing now and what's expected in the future in terms of if we're going to change those outputs and outcomes. We underestimate how sophisticated and complex our innovations are. So we implicitly say, all you have to do is jump over. I don't think you can do that with most of the things that we're about. I think you have to have a bridge called implementation. In our research, we've identified 3 different ways that you can assess how far across the bridge an individual, an organization, a system is in terms of implementing whatever the new change may be. So if we're going to do evaluation, it seems like the first step is to be evaluating how far across the bridge our users are. And then if we're going to do summative or output or outcome evaluation, we better take into account whether they're far across the bridge or not. So my illustration for this, to continue this metaphor, would be to suggest that we can use these 3 ideas. One being stages of concern, which deals with the feelings and perceptions that are out there with regard to a change. Another would be levels of use, which is an operationally defined construct that ranges from non-use to being a novice to being an expert with whatever the change may be. And then the third is innovation specific. We discovered a number of decades ago that implementers change and adapt the innovation, and sometimes they mutate it, but they will claim that they're using it. So we've ended up talking about different configurations of an innovation. Another thing about our work has been, I ended up one time noodling around with different strategies for change, different kinds of interventions, and came up with names for them like Pennsylvania Contingent and Rent-A-Martyr, and talked about how these would work. And the one that I think applies today in terms of what we're about here is well, I should point these things out along the way. These constructs can be applied to individuals and groups, and each has got an extensive history of research with it. But my metaphor, we're talking about a multiple adoption design. So tried for a little humor there, a little bit along the way. So, all right. Now, if we use the bridge metaphor, what's going on is we've got multiple bridges. And as David said in his introduction, and as AJ did, we've got all of these things interacting with each other. So from an implementation and evaluation point of view, as will be talked about tomorrow by Abe, we've got issues of capacity, but we've also got the different bridges going on, and we've got all these different interactions that are taking place, and all these different outcomes that are going on. And so part of what happens in a multiple adoption design is we've got to run what happens with each initiative individually, but we've also got to think a lot more about the interactions between them. All right, not knowing how my time is going, but moving along. To illustrate this idea real quickly, using those three evidence-based constructs, I've attempted to put together three different innovations that might be going on in the same system. And if we were to do, and these timelines are unrealistic probably, but I've tried to run an October set of assessments and then an April set of assessments, just as a for example. So for innovation one, when we start off, we've got 60% of the participants with self-concerns. Now, there have been some sort of interventions, a successful process going on, so that by April, only 30% have self-concerns, and 60% now have task concerns. That would be the typical kind of progression I would hope to see in an implementation effort. The next set, innovation two, as you can now begin to see in the pattern, the only change we really get is more self-concerns. The third group, dealing with innovation three, is a more typical kind of progression as well when you go from not having anybody, you have a start with some people that are at task concerns, but then you get more with task concerns and fewer with self-concerns, and you end up with some with impact concerns. And by the way, impact concerns is the goal. This is where the new approach is implemented and the concerns are on, not me, they're not on how much time it's taking, but it's on how is this affecting our clients? And what can I do to have even more impact on my clients? Which should be the goal of a change effort. If you look at the same thing with levels of use, this is dealing with not your feelings and perceptions, but your behaviors. And we would start with people, there are three different ways you can be a non-user in terms of your behavior, including people at level of use 0, they're not doing anything. You send out the announcements, they don't read it. You require them to come to a meeting, they don't attend. Or in my case, they'll end up in the back of the room knitting or something if they're required to be there. So behavior-wise, they're not engaged. What we find when they first implement it, they're going to be what we call mechanical use, level 3. There's a disjointedness. There's like me with this PowerPoint and pushing the wrong key. There's a studying at night about what you've got to do tomorrow. You can't plan ahead very far. We find that 60 to 70, if not more percent of first-time implementers will be in a mechanical use. Not the time to do a summative evaluation. So if you look at our same three cases, in case one, the first innovation, we're starting off in October with nearly all of our target group as non-users. And then we watch the progression. By April, we got 65% that are now at mechanical use and 10% are at higher levels of use. No, I'm sorry, that was, yeah, we're on levels of use, okay. For innovation 2, we got nothing going on. Now, in both cases, you don't need to know what the innovation is. It's just sitting there, and we've got a construct to talk about it across programs, across initiatives, using the same variables that are evidence-based. The third innovation is moving along in a nice developmental progression that I would expect, only this is a naive approach. It would usually take 3 or 4 years to have them get that far along. The next construct, innovation configurations, takes a little more explanation. This is the one where we're talking about the innovation. So this measurement is going to be innovation specific. And so we build what we call an innovation configuration map. Now, for you all that have rubric-itis At first, you're going to see this as a rubric, which in many ways it is. But for most of you that are doing rubrics, you'll know that the most highly proficient description will have lots of words. And as you get less and less proficient, the number of words gets less. But in this particular example here, a component out of a configuration map, the number of words staying roughly the same. This is because of the structure in building a configuration map, where we, first of all, will have the ideal practice at the left and call it A, and then a string of variations going across that don't just taper off on the ideal, but they're doing something else. So as you move further to the right, we're building up descriptions of what they're doing instead. So if you're not too drowned in the fire hose yet, let me just show you what would happen. And the bridge is reversed now, unfortunately. Trust me, there's reasons for this. But in Innovation 1, you can see we've got heavily loaded to the right, the traditional practice. Innovation 2, all we got is traditional practice. We've got no hint of the new way. In Innovation 3, we've got developmental progression going. Our colleague timekeeper from Rhode Island has given me the 5-minute minus sign, so let's go on to a couple of questions. If we go back to the basic questions, at this point that I asked at the beginning, right now we know a lot about making that adoption decision. We know a lot about how to facilitate implementing single innovations in programs. We don't know as much as we need to about sustaining use. Sustaining and what happens after people get across the bridge, I don't think we know a lot about at all. And we know even less about facilitating and evaluating multiple initiatives. A couple of methodological suggestions for us to be thinking about. I think we have to do implementation assessment of each intervention that's being done, or innovation, depending on your words. And a part of that, we need to assess implementation, for sure. But the whole set has to be examined differently than looking at each one separately. I think we should be addressing the change process within it. Naturally, I could plug some constructs that I think we ought to use. To do this, to be a part of this session, suggested, and Paul said it as well at the beginning, that we ought to challenge our thinking a little bit. So there's my escape route in case I get too far away from where we want to be. Here's some things to think about conceptually. Assessing each implementation bridge provides useful information that can be used by leaders, implementers, researchers, and policy. If we use some standard constructs like stages of concern and levels of use, everyone can work off the same set of data. And if you're a leader and you got people in mechanical use, you know your interventions have to be different than if you have people at a higher level of use. What else did I put up here? We need to understand more about what is entailed in sustaining. Yes. There are important differences between a problem and a dilemma. And when I'm working with graduate students in leadership, one of the things I try to have them understand is this difference. A problem, by definition, has a solution. A dilemma, by definition, does not. Now, I know in the health sciences we have to deal more with trying to find specific solutions. So with that caveat, let me suggest that the current evidence-based practices and initiatives are designed to address problems. However, there seems to be a preoccupation with achieving fidelity of implementation of these. And I think we need to think more about the capacity that results from having these different efforts implemented, rather than assuming we've got to have for the first time an ongoing fidelity for whatever reason the innovation was implemented. The evaluation of outcomes needs to be broad spectrum. The intended outputs of each program needs to be thought about, but the consequences intended and unintended needs to be thought about. Growth in capacity, I think, becomes more important that we have to start thinking about than just the output from the particular innovation. We need to think, yep, okay. The last point would be leadership is critical in all of this. Give me 5 minutes with your leader and I'll tell you how good your change process will go. And for any of you that were wondering, I did one last thing just for fun, and that was, there is a book, but if you want to work on it in Chinese or in Korean, it's also published there. So, thank you.